This is a closer look with the Monitor. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Prairie Public. Two stories now making headlines at the North Dakota Monitor raise important questions about how state regulators balance economic development, environmental protection, and public interest. First, today we'll examine the legal challenges surrounding the permit for what would become one of North Dakota's largest dairy operations, where opponents argue state regulators failed to adequately evaluate potential environmental impacts. Then we'll turn to an ongoing courtroom dispute over the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline, where attorneys debated whether the North Dakota Public Service Commission can even consider public safety when approving pipeline routes. Joining us to dissect both of these issues is Jeff Beach, Deputy Editor of the North Dakota Monitor. Jeff, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Craig.
Jeff, let's begin with this proposed dairy. Give us an overview of the project and why it's become so controversial.
The dairy that the hearing was about is actually called the Herberg Dairy, kind of southeast of Hillsboro, actually not far from the town of Halstead, Minnesota. That one is 25,000 cows is what they are proposing, double the size of the one at Abercrombie, which is a little further along in its construction phase. So the likes of these kinds of dairies have not been seen in North Dakota, which has had a dwindling dairy cow population over several decades. Farms are usually maybe a couple hundred cows. So the scope, the size and scope of these dairy farms is unlike anything North Dakota has seen before. The company that is planning these dairies is based in Morris, Minnesota, west central Minnesota, really not that far from the Wahpeton site, the Abercrombie site. So they operate several milking operations that include thousands of cows at the sites that they've been operating.
Opponents recently argued before a judge that the dairy's permit should be reversed. What are the central legal arguments that they're making, Jeff?
So the permit came from the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality. The opponents, kind of led by the Dakota Resource Council in North Dakota, are basically asserting that the Department of Environmental Quality didn't do a thorough enough job in evaluating some of the potential pollutants that would come from the dairy operation. The dairy does provide a manure management plan. They call it a nutrient management plan. But the attorneys for the Dakota Resource Council pointed to some things that they say, the department should have given further consideration. The proximity to the floodplain, the dairy is not far from the Red River, how drain tile that farmers use to, drain fields more quickly in the spring, to how that might impact runoff from manure that is spread on fields. So things of that nature that they are saying that the permit process should go back to the DEQ for further scrutiny.
So, Jeff, then are the supporters saying, hey, we've been through the process of DEQ permitting, we've met whatever bars that they've set for us, we should move forward?
Yeah, so the Department of Environmental Quality, they basically are saying, the DEQ answered all the questions that came through in public comment period. They held a public hearing in Hillsboro, answered questions there. That's actually something they didn't do with the Abercrombie dairy. There was no public hearing with the Abercrombie dairy. So, they say they've, examined, the management plan, construction plan, operation plans, their environmental monitoring plan. So DEQ is basically saying our process was thorough.
So what economic benefits are being touted here?
The dairy does create a certain number of jobs, and there is actually some housing that's comes along with a dairy of that size because they need people there 24/7. So actually, the first things that have been built at the Herberg Dairy near Halstead are kind of living quarters for people that will work at the dairy. I think the main economic benefit that Trail County would see is another market for farmers to sell corn and other feed products to the dairy, and then in return, farmers, they Riverview Dairy works with farmers to have them spread manure that comes from the dairy onto their farm fields, which potentially reduces the farmer's fertilizer cost. So those kinds of things are of benefit to the local economy. There will be a lot of trucking in and out of that dairy too, and just a general uptick in economic activity around the dairy.
So is this case, Jeff, really about a single dairy here, or could the court's decisions establish broader expectations for environmental reviews of large livestock operations to come?
Yeah, I think it certainly could. If the Dakota Resource Council were to prevail, I think it would put some pressure on the Department of Environmental Quality to do a more comprehensive environmental review for large dairies or other livestock operations. They often are referred to as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, if you hear that term. So I think it certainly would put some pressure on DEQ to do that. And North Dakota's leadership, the legislature and Department of Agriculture, and from Doug Burgum when he was governor, he was making growing animal agriculture in North Dakota a priority. North Dakota's kind of fallen behind its neighbors in things like dairy cows and hog production, especially.
What happens next in this particular case, and do we know when we can expect a ruling?
I don't know when we can expect a ruling. That'll be up to Judge Susan Bailey. I would, what I've heard is that, it would likely be before the end of the year. I think, I would guess that the judge will take probably at least a month. So that's, but really it's up to the judge.
You're listening to A Closer Look with the Monitor. I'm Craig Blumenshine, and I'm visiting with Jeff Beach. He's the deputy editor of the North Dakota Monitor. We've been discussing legal challenges to North Dakota's largest proposed dairy projects. Now, Jeff, let's shift to another courtroom dispute, this one involving the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline and an argument over whether public safety is even something state regulators are allowed to consider when approving the pipeline. Those state regulators say it's not. Jeff, this hearing produced a statement that caught many people's attention that public safety isn't a factor for the Public Service Commission that they can legally consider. So explain what happened.
So there are landowners along the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline route, or proposed route in North Dakota, as well as two counties, Emmons County in south central North Dakota, and Burleigh County, which is Bismarck, where the main trunk of this pipeline would go through both of those counties. Their individual cases have been kind of lumped together into one case, landowners and those two counties together, that are challenging the Public Service Commission's issuance of a permit for the pipeline, the carbon capture pipeline. The public safety aspect of that hearing kind of was really raised by the attorney for the Public Service Commission, Zachary Pelham. So he's the one who kind of raised the idea that the Public Service Commission really is preempted by federal authorities on assessing the safety of a pipeline operation like that. There's a so it I think it kind of took the judge by surprise. I think it kind of took the other attorneys by surprise. It certainly took me by surprise. So
me too. When I read the story, and it just makes you ask if the Public Service Commission can't consider pipeline safety. What exactly is its role when they're reviewing a pipeline permit?
Right. So that is kind of the question that the judge asked Zachary Pelham, and he said that the Public Service Commission can make sure that things like that safety precautions like safety valves or shutoff valves are in place, and can ask questions about how they might operate, just to make sure that those things are in place. But he said really, the Public Service Commission can check for the impact on the public welfare for things such as noise pollution or the appearance of the structure might be going in, and its impact on the potential impact on the environment and wildlife and things like state-owned lands. So that was kind of where Mr. Pelham went with his answer.
The hearing also involved discussion that you pointed out, Jeff, of Summit Carbon's dioxide plume dispersion model. What is that, and why has that become an issue in this lawsuit?
That was, has been a topic of discussion all during the hearings leading up to that Public Service Commission decision. And essentially, I haven't seen it, so I can't exactly tell you what's in it. But Summit Carbon Solutions has developed some sort of model for if there were a rupture, of the pipeline under high pressure, how quickly would the gas escape from the pipeline? Where might it go, depending on the weather conditions, depending on the topography? How quickly can the valves get shut off? And assuming that they're shut off, that the shut off valves, what might emergency responders and the public be looking at, and where might that gas end up going? So, carbon dioxide in concentrated amounts is a deadly gas. So that is something that the public asked for, attorneys for these parties asked for, but has never been made public.
Attorneys challenging the permit also questioned alternative routes and local setback requirements. What were those arguments?
So so both Emmons County and Burleigh County have tried to or increased the setback distances from a pipeline in their counties. Summit and had basically said the setbacks were so far away from any potential pipeline that you're basically making it impossible for us to route a pipeline through your county. There was also a challenge to whether or not state setback rules take precedence over those county ordinances. And the Public Service Commission has determined that yes, that is their stance, that rule takes precedence over those local ordinances. But the attorneys for the counties don't feel like that issue is settled quite yet from their arguments yesterday. So that's kind of the setback part of the argument. Some there was some discussion of an alternative route instead of going kind of around the north side of Bismarck to the carbon storage site. Perhaps there could be a southern route, and attorneys basically said that alternative route was not given enough discussion, not given enough analysis during the Public Service Commission's deliberations on the permit.
I'll go back to the safety question. The judge asked, I think, what many listeners are probably wondering: if the Public Service Commission can't regulate safety, then who does? How is that question answered?
Well, there is through the federal Department of Transportation that they regulate pipelines, especially interstate pipelines. Within the Department of Transportation, there is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, also known as PHMSA when people are discussing it. So the attorney for the North Dakota Public Service Commission basically deferred to PHMSA as the entity that would make sure that the pipeline is constructed of the proper material, buried at a certain depth, has shut-off valves, in regular increments, and proper monitoring systems, those kinds of things. So the attorney deferred to on those kinds of what he described as the safety aspect of the pipeline.
Given that Summit has announced plans to pursue carbon storage in Wyoming, while continuing to express interest in North Dakota, how does the changing landscape affect the significance of this lawsuit, Jeff?
Well, it's the Summit's attorneys were still active in this case. They They basically followed the argument set out by the Public Service Commission. It could, like the dairy, it could kind of set an interesting precedent one way or the other as far as the scope of the Public Service Commission's authority and what they might be expected, required, perhaps under the judge's eyes to evaluate when it comes to hazardous materials pipelines.
Jeff Beach is the deputy editor of the North Dakota Monitor. You can read these stories, of course, at the North Dakota Monitor, along with his continuing coverage of state government, the courts, energy, ag, and public policy. All of that is without paywalls or the need to subscribe. Jeff, thanks for helping us understand these important issues, and thanks for being with us on A Closer Look with the Monitor.
Thanks for having me, Craig.